So this is Balance of Powers by Compass Games. There we go, there's the box over there. There's danger lurking on the sofa. So Balance of Powers by Compass Games, yeah. This is a sort of, from what I can tell, a sort of light strategic look at the entirety of World War I. It's played on 3 map sheets, but I am only playing an introductory scenario. As you can see here, it's already underway. An introductory scenario which just covers the opening 3 months, August 1914 to October 1914. What am I talking about? So August to October. I'm coming into the start of the September monthly turn. So to explain a little bit about the turn sequence, this will be familiar to anyone who's played something like Empires in Arms or probably dozens of other games. There are monthly turns, as you can see, but then there are these seasonal interphases. And basically, so the game starts here in August or in one of the Augusts, and then you get the autumn interphase almost immediately after, and then in this turn you'll get September, October. You can see I've put some reinforcements that have been bought for October from the force pools. So I've done the August turn and then the autumn interphase, and the interphase is basically just where you calculate your resource points for the next 3 months, and those resource points are being tracked up on this chart over here, so you can see everyone's resource points. Now these are used to buy reinforcements, they're used to pay for attacks, and they can also be used on quite a lot of combat results. They can be used to pay off losses. So instead of taking a loss, the chart will offer you a RP result where you can pay a resource point not to take a loss, which is rather nice. They're also used for rail movement, so essentially those are pretty vital to any sort of war effort. You need them to attack, you need them to survive, you need them to rail move, and you need them to buy reinforcements. So the situation we've got after the August turn, pretty much stalemated on the French-German border here. The French were obliged to make some planned 17 attacks into Germany, which didn't go too badly for them. They actually took some mountains down here outside Belfort, and that has just given them something of a buffer where they can then strip some forces away from Belfort and rail them elsewhere, which they did up in this direction towards Paris and Amiens. Joffrey has entered the game and is trying to pull together something of a defence here around Saint-Quentin, the Maubeuge area. The German Schlieffen Plan attacked through Belgium and Holland, as you can see. Kluck there actually did take Lille, but was counterattacked by the British Expeditionary Force out of Calais and repelled and retreated back to the edge of Brussels there. An interesting point I'm going to make at this point just about the combat system, if I can find a way to hold the camera while using my tweezers. I'm not sure I've even got my tweezers. So let's see if I can find some tweezers. Yeah, there we go. So, and a little point about this combat then. So, Kluck, as you can see, has got 2 numbers on him, 4 and 2. When he attacks, he rolls a dice, and if he gets less than 4, he gets a +1 bonus in combat. If he defends, he rolls a dice, and if he gets less than 2, he gets +1 in combat. So you can see that he's significantly more effective on the attack than on the defence. The German force at the time had this guard unit in it, which I'll just stick up in here in the channel, that guard unit, and you can see it's got a yellow 3, and that's its effectiveness. And that the yellow effectiveness means that in 1914 it's a 4 on the attack. So what that all means is that if this German stack with Kluck and the guard unit, as were attacking, they had an attack of an effectiveness of 4 and a 66% chance of a +1 on the die roll. If they were defending, they had an effectiveness of 3 and only a 33% chance of a +1. The British are in the same situation with the yellow effectiveness ratings. The BEF here have 3s for their infantry. And so the result of all those little modifiers is that whoever attacks is guaranteed to be 2 better off on the combat in the combat results, because you're either at +1 or -1, so there's a net shift of 2, and given Kluck's ratings, if the Germans are attacking, they're likely to be 3 better off, and if they're defending, they're likely not to be. So there's quite a shift here. You know, the Germans attacking, probably 3 better off. The British attacking, probably 2 better off. So the Germans had moved up and taken Lille, and the British had waited to counterattack, and did so successfully. Kluck lost 2 corps, the BAF lost 1, which is in the rebuilds. And that was the end of August. The French then moved up some forces to sort of bolster the northern side of France. Over here on the East Front, the Austro-Hungarians pushed north from their starting positions, attempting to take Lutsk, but the Russians reinforced it pretty heavily, as you can see, and now Conrad's wondering if he should even be here at all. Suddenly quite a lot more Russians appeared than he had anticipated. I hadn't really looked at the reinforcement schedules that closely. Meanwhile, there's a significant Russian force here that's headed south-west out of Warsaw and is looking at potentially at Breslau, or maybe dropping down here to Krakow. Breslau looks favourite. There's also some Russian forces that could put some threat onto Königsberg as well, as was more historically the case, where I think the Russians made more of their efforts up in this area. But I dropped the main Russian force down here towards Breslau. So the Germans now have that the classic dilemma of where to allocate their resources. They get 5 rail moves in a turn, I think, and they have Erich Ludendorff's just appeared here. Ludendorff, sorry, he's just appeared with an there was some reserves in Frankfurt, so he's got a potent army there in Frankfurt. They have some reserves in Berlin. They've got 5 rail moves, and they've got to decide quite where to go. Ideally, I would like the time to take Ludendorff here, slide him up the rails through here, drop him in next to the British Expeditionary Force, and try and take Lille, while Kluck gathers a new force and has a go at Maubeuge, perhaps, something like that. That would be what I'd be hoping to achieve, and then taking San Quentin afterwards. But obviously, you've got to be conscious of the fact that Königsberg could be under threat, and Breslau could be under threat as well. How long can you wait before you have to throw a bit of extra force their way? Because the Russians are in. They're in. If they move through these Russians, then they're in striking distance of. Yes, they will be. They'll be in striking distance of Breslau. So this Russian force could attack and take Breslau this month. There's 4 corps there. There'd be 2 defenders, the fortress and that. So they've got 2 to 1, although 2 to 1 in this game is pretty much worthless. In terms of attacking, in terms of modifiers anyway. But still, there's the Russians. It's more attritional, so the Russians could take the losses and the Germans couldn't, and that would see them take Breslau if they could just do enough damage. And similarly up here, they're not within striking range of Königsberg, so Königsberg can probably wait. But do they have to reinforce Breslau, is the question. But it's the Germans to go, and so I have to make that decision now. I'm tempted to let the Russians do their worst at Breslau. Well, actually I'm going to have a look at how easy it would be to get stuff down there to recapture it. I think if that Russian force takes it, it's going to be awfully hard to shift, even with this army in Berlin. I might be more prudent to reinforce, but I want to get Ludendorff into the action. Decisions. Staying with balance of powers then, by Compass Games, and here I've just done the first fortnight of September for the Germans. Monthly turns are divided into 2 fortnights, and you get a Central Powers sort of impulse, and then a Entente impulse, and then you do the second fortnight and do the same again. So the Germans have activated across the board, and they had a horrible time of it. They really did. Kluck picked up some forces and attacked into Lille, which is now held now there 1RS, and was repulsed with losses. Then he attacked again and traded casualties, and he was pretty much done at that point. Then the Germans paid resources to rail in Ludendorff and 5 corps to attack Lille and attempt to take it. He was repulsed with losses. Then he traded losses, and he was done. And then they had to activate 3 more corps, and finally they took the last corps out in Lille with losses. It's cost the Germans all their momentum. It's cost them about 4 corps and significant resource points to do that. Maybe 6 resources, and those resource points are scarce just to take Lille. But Lille is these hexes with the grey borders are what you're trying to capture. These are called bargaining chips. They're basically victory hexes in any other game. That's what you're trying to take to win the game. So they had to keep pressing and attack there, because if they didn't, and the British were just left, even with a cavalry corps, which is what they ended up holding Lille with, but even that, they've got another corps that's appeared, which they'd have shipped over. They could have entrenched. It was just so the Germans just had to keep hammering away until they took it, but it's just cost them way too much for this to be a successful campaign now. Their forces have been thinned out, they've spent too many resources. They'll look at taking San Quentin, I think, and that will probably be the limits of their ambitions right now, because things have gone horribly. So unless they get some really, really nice attacking results, against the French. They're in trouble in terms of this attack. Well, not in trouble, but this attack's going to peter out. Over here on the East Front, the Germans just shuffled around a few forces, so they reinforced Königsberg by marching from Danzig, and then they sort of did a chain of marches with the army corps each moving up to so you can see that Posen's empty, but that's the one under sort of least threat, and they've got forces nearby that can move into Posen should anything attempt to scurry towards it. They've also got a couple of cavalry corps here that's moving down to try and add some defence to Breslau here, but they couldn't afford. They used all their round moves, moving Ludendorff in on his ill-fated attack against Lille. So they've got no round moves to do any reinforcing over here. They're just going to have to give the Russians their best shot. It's now time for the Austro-Hungarians to do something. I'm not entirely convinced that they can do much, but they may have to attack the Russians here just because it's a victory point hex and they've got an army next to it, and they may as well give it a shot and see what happens. In contrast to the Germans, very effective stuff for the Austro-Hungarians here. Conrad did attack into Lutsk. He had a 4 effectiveness infantry unit, those Tyrolean infantry. I assume that's what Tyrol or something stands for. Anyway, 4 effectiveness. The best the Russians had was 2, so they had a +2 for that. He made his effectiveness die roll, so that was a +3, and he rolled a 7, 10, and a 10 on the combat table. 1 loss for the Austrians, the Tyroleans, 2 losses for the Russians, and give ground, more importantly. So the 2 Russian corps were killed, but that army had to give ground and retreated towards its supply lines 2 hexes up into this area here. But that gave the Austrians their prize. So with that success in hand, the Austrians decided that discretion was the better part of valour and withdrew back into their own borders. There's just too much Russian stuff out there to really want to go fighting across the whole front, so they just reinforced these cities, reinforced Krakow, and are moving this Vienna infantry down to reinforce Krakow as well, wary of a big army here under Samsonov. So that's the Austro-Hungarians done. They've spent minimal resource points, just the 1 on their attack, and they've taken their objective hex, so they're reasonably content right now. On the Eastern Front, in balance of powers, I've had to do some recalculation. I didn't realise that there was a fortress in Lutsk. So when the Austrians took it, the Russians could have taken their losses by ruining that fortress, because they were going to have to retreat anyway, which they did, but it meant that the Russian force was much more heavily intact, and there were more Russians around up here, who then all counterattacked and gave Conrad a very nasty shock, and he lost 2 corps and had to retreat back to safety. So the Russians have regained Lutsk there with very handily, and have actually taken not much in the way of losses. They then, buoyed by that, they then came down over here, and Samsonov attacked into Breslau, which is now ruined as a fortress, but the Germans were forced to give ground as well. Samsonov went in. So the Russians have taken minimal losses, and have their own fortress back, and this one over here in Breslau. Were I playing a full campaign game, the losses of these interior fortresses would be causing countries, I think, to make demoralisation rolls. They might even be costing an automatic point of demoralisation to lose them. And demoralisation drives you towards crisis and revolution in the case of certain countries. Russia, one of them; Germany, another. I can't remember what the others are. Turkey, maybe. You can see on this chart, you'll see things saying Russian political crisis and British political crisis, and so on. The political crisis sections in here. You can see, therefore, that you don't have a lot of those demoralisation points to play with. In other words, if the French amass 7, and you can get them just from losing battles, badly, losing fortresses, taking attrition losses, all kinds of things, and you do not have a lot to play with. You can see that the French get up to 7, I think the Ottomans 5, the British only 8, and the Austro-Hungarians 9, the Germans 10, and so on. And that's, for the entirety of the game. If you're playing a full campaign, you've got 7 or 8 to play with, 7 to play with as the French, and that's for 5 years of fighting. So anyway, these fortress losses would be extremely significant were they in the full campaign, given that I'm just giving the scenario a run through. Not quite so much, but just to point that out. Anyway, successful stuff from the Russians there. So this looks like it's favouring the Entente at the moment. I think the Russians, they've got loads of resource points. I'm gonna make a move against Königsberg at least, even if I don't get to attack it this turn, and then that will be the first fortnight of September 1914 done. Balance of powers, end of September 1914 in this 3-month scenario before the leaves fall. Horrible September for the Central Powers, I think. Yeah, pretty horrible. Ludendorff was stopped in his tracks by Joffrey in a battle for St. Quentin. The Germans went in with 4 or 5 corps. Joffrey had 4 corps. Both sides made a leadership roll. Joffrey failed his with a 5. Ludendorff made his with a 1, and ended up with a +1 on the die roll. The effectiveness on both sides was 3. +1 on the dice roll, rolled a 3. Horrible result. That was modified to a 4 by his leadership, but still two corps loss for the Germans, 1 for the French. Joffrey was then able to reinforce out of Reims and bring himself back to full strength. The Germans just running out of resource points here. They're down to 2 resource points for the rest of the game, which is 2 attacks essentially. So they've pretty much stalled out. They're going to get an opportunity perhaps to have an attack into Longwy, but you can see the blue stripes at the top. This is the reverse side of the counters. The French have now had the opportunity to dig in, so they are under Joffrey there, and apart from this 3-3 here, but they have now entrenched in this line between Maubeuge and Amiens. That means they're going to be significantly harder to dislodge now. So we're moving away from the mobile warfare and into the trench warfare. The French have now got their position where they're able to dig in here and dig in down the front line down here. So the Germans have to pick an attack and go for it. Maybe they can make another one into St. Quentin with one of their resource points, and potentially one into Longwy here with the other one. That's about it for them. Over on the Eastern Front here, the Russians have taken Breslau, and there's really not a lot. The Germans just don't have the force to contest it, or the resource points to. And the Russians rolled 4 corps in towards Königsberg, the first attack they made was inconclusive. The second one was decisive. They rolled, that was their dice roll there, an 11. With no modifiers on the roll, it was an even dice roll. And that's three. That was 3 losses for the Germans, and that was enough to ruin the already reduced fortress and destroy the 2 German corps that were in there. So Königsberg's fallen as well. That's horrible for the Germans, and this has been a textbook example of how not to open World War I for the Central Powers. They're back to where they started over here in Austria-Hungary, and actually quite thankful that the Russians haven't made any particularly aggressive moves in this direction. But if you look at the dead piles, there's the German and Austro-Hungarian losses, and that's quite significant. And there's the Allies, you know. So the only yes, I'm just seeing all those Belgian corps in there. The bright light for the German corps was that a couple of corps, the siege guns had already done a number on the Antwerp fortress. So a couple of corps were able to attack into Belgium, and their higher efficiency and so on was enough to sweep aside the Belgians, and they did take that hex in Antwerp. So that's it for the end of September. So there's a bit of mustering to go on at the start of October, and then we will see what the Allies can do, particularly over in Russia, where they have the force to perhaps take another bargaining chip hex if they can get to it. The distances over here and the movements of 2 and 3 mean that in a couple of activations you are really struggling, but they will see if there's a realistic hope of putting an attack into Posen. I think I haven't looked at the really victory conditions, so I don't know how. I can sort of tell from the flow of the game that the Central Powers are doing quite badly. Whether they're doing badly enough to actually lose this scenario, or whether the Entente need to push harder, I don't really know. I don't even care. I'm just going to play out October and then tot up the scores at the end. Or October 1914, here in this first scenario before the leaves fall in Balance of Powers by Compass Games. I'm pretty much going to call it because the Germans are out of resource points with which to pay for attacks. They made an attempt to take Longwy here, and the French had entrenched, were able to call, being entrenched allowed them to call in reserves, so the Iron Corps, their 20th Corps, the Iron Corps, were able to reinforce out of Verdun, and the Germans were defeated there, lost a corps. The French just had to pay a resource point. So that failed. With their final resource point, they preferred the look of attacking into Königsberg up here, which is a ruined fortress. Sent 6 corps up at the Russians. Had a +1 for a 3-to-1 odds, and +1 I think for effectiveness, so a +2, but still only rolled a 4, and that meant that the Russians didn't take any losses, just paid a resource point not to take losses. The Germans lost a corps, and that's them out of points. So the Germans can no longer attack. All they can do is defend what they have, which unfortunately for them isn't much, because they've lost Königsberg, and down here they've lost Breslau. The only way for the Central Powers to get any bargaining chip locations is if the Austro-Hungarians can launch a successful attack into, say, Lutsk here. The trouble is that, of course, there's no way they can do that while simultaneously offering a viable defence of Lemberg, which isn't a fortress. So to defend, they can defend Lemberg, or they can attack the ruins at Lutsk, but they can't do both with the forces available, especially when you look at the sheer number of corps that the Russians have in terms. So the numerical advantage for the Russians really does make that a daunting proposition to even try. So I've done a quick total, and the Central Powers win if they have more than 13, so 14 or more of the victory hexes, or the bargaining chip hexes as they're called. And the Entente win if they have more than 6, so 7 plus. And currently the Entente have 7. They have Lutsk for 1, they have Breslau for 2, they have Warsaw for 3, Minsk for 4, Königsberg for 5, and then over in Western Europe they've held on to San Quentin for 6, and they still have Longwy for 7. So that's a win for the that's a win for the Entente in this opening game. There's really no incentive for them to do anything else, and I could faff around with these Austrians trying to take Lutsk, but I really, it's going to take them a turn to move up, and in that time they could have lost Lemberg because there's cavalry there just ready to move in. So they'd have to keep 2 or 3 corps back to protect Lemberg. That only gives them a corps or 2 with which to attack into these Russians, and that really isn't a viable proposition at all. I didn't even put the French reinforcements on the board. That was rather stupid. The French could have been reinforced. We'll stick them in Verdun. That would have probably been the most. Well, 1 in Verdun and 1 in Amiens would have been a likely sort of outcome. So, yeah. All irrelevant now. It's a comfortable win for the Entente, and really, to be honest, once this German attack stalled out in September and had a horrible time trying to defeat the British Expeditionary Force there, and it soaked up far too many of their resource points. They ran out of steam really to be able to press, and with only two resource points to pay for attacks coming into October, there was almost nothing that they could do to regain the initiative. So yeah, there it is. Really interesting game. Feels a lot like Unconditional Surrender, World War II in Europe, in that you activate stacks and fight and move with them sort of one at a time while paying from a very, very limited resource pool to actually pay for your attacks. I guess the difference between this and Unconditional Surrender will be in the longer term you can build up resource points, you can hoard them because they are cumulative from turn to turn, unlike USC. So that will change the dynamics slowly over a longer game, but in a 3-month game like this with only one seasonal interface in which to get resource points, you're on a finite, you're on a very limited number, and the Germans didn't use theirs well. I in addition to soaking up resources making these attacks, which they had to do, but I did rebuild 2 cores which cost 4 which they didn't have to do. They had enough coming on as reserves and so on that they could have not rebuilt, and that was 4 points that they could have had to spend on more movement, no, more attacking in this October turn. But I didn't know that at the time, so there it is. Bad decision, and you know they weren't doing well anyway. But you know they could have, had they had more points, they could have had another 1, 2. No, they couldn't. They don't have the movement points. But in the second month of October, they could have had another crack at Königsberg. They could potentially have had another crack at Longwy. They might have had an attack down here into Joffre and St Quentin. So, you know, they might have mustered some sort of counter-attack against Breslau. Who knows? But anyway, there it is. All done.